Okay, today we are going to be making my homemade whole wheat bread. And so I'm going to help y'all through this little process and hopefully maybe troubleshoot some things because I had a lot of difficulties when I very first started making bread, so I hope this will help. Okay, the first part of this, you're going to proof your yeast, and it calls for 1 package active dry yeast or 1 cake compressed yeast, 1/4 cup of water, 2.5 cups hot water. I just combined it in here into 2 3/4 cups of hot water. Now you don't want it too hot. If it's too hot that you put your finger in it and it burns, you're going to kill your yeast. So don't, just have it pretty warm, but not hot. So I have 2 3/4 cups of hot water in there. I have a 1/2 cup of brown sugar compressed because you want it to be sweet. 3 teaspoons salt. 1/4 cup of shortening is what it calls for, but I just use oil, just regular old vegetable oil will do fine. It always works the same. And this is the particular kind of yeast that I like to use. This is Fleischmann's Active Dry Yeast. And if you have some old recipe books like I do, it will a lot of times like give you cakes of yeast. But if you turn it on the back over here, see where it says it? Right here. It gives you conversions as far as cakes go. I think I looked up the cakes, but it gives you conversions for how much this dry yeast is compared to a package. So let's get started. So you'll need a mixer. You can do all this by hand, by the way. You don't necessarily need to have a KitchenAid. I'm just very grateful and fortunate that I have one. So these are the 2 attachments that I'll be using. So we can go ahead and get started. So what you're going to do is you have your hot water in here. Go ahead and throw in your oil. Make sure and get all that in there. Your salt. And your brown sugar. Okay, now we're going to put on this paddle attachment. This thing always confuses me sometimes on how to get it on there. Okay, and you want to get the sugar and all this ingredients really good and mixed up because, hold on, I'll show you here in a second. It's about to get noisy. Yeast is a fungus, so it is a living thing. Throw some biology in here. And so in order to make this grow and thrive for your bread, you have to supply it with certain things. Temperature has to be optimal, which is why we have it warm. Warm is always good for any type of living creature. You also have to supply it with food, which is what the sugar's doing. So whenever, I'll open up this yeast jar real quick, that way you can see. This yeast, it looks like tiny little granules. And actually that's the fungus's defense mechanism. Whenever it's times of drought, natural yeast will do something. It won't look exactly like this, but they'll actually make a capsule in not prime living conditions, and this actually they're able to stay dormant, so to speak, for a long time, years, until optimal environments come around. And that's basically what we're giving this right here, is the optimal environment for it to thrive in. Food, warmth, so it's able to reproduce. Okay, that's good and mixed up. Now, it calls for 1 package active dry yeast. So what we're going to do is look on the back portion of this. And see what it says. 2 1/4 teaspoons. is what the conversion is. So, we shall do that. You know, one of my biggest issues whenever I was first making bread was I could not figure out how to get the yeast activated. I don't even know how many loaves of bread that I absolutely just messed up. But I wasn't, either had the water too hot or not hot enough. So we'll just give this a light little stir. And that'll be good. So the question still remains, how do you know whenever this yeast is active? Because that was my biggest issue. Well, this will get extremely foamy. And what you're going to want to do is let this sit for about 10 minutes. And we'll come back in 10 minutes. And I'll show you what it looks like then. But, as you can see, some of it is kind of getting a little frothy. If we can zoom in on this just a little bit. It's hard to tell. It's kind of fun. Ah, there we go. You see this part right here? It is duplicating. And that's what you're going to want to look for. There's a lot of recipes that I've had to modify. For instance, if it just calls for warm water activating yeast, I've never had any luck activating yeast with warm water. It just doesn't work. I've never had any luck with warm milk either. But if the recipe does call for that, for just warm water or just warm milk, just warm it up and just throw like a teaspoon or so of sugar in there. I mean, as long as it has a tiny bit of food, it's going to activate. Period. I mean, no questions asked. And you can see how fast that all of this fungus is like, yeah, I got food. So they're doing their thing, reproducing. That's why we got wonderful things like bread and beer. Whoever thought to put something growing out in the wild in some flour and egg and mix it up? Who knows? Okay, well, we'll come back in 10 minutes and take a look at this, and I'll show you the next step. Okay, this is what the yeast looks like after about 10 minutes. So you can see that it's definitely activated itself and it's gotten really frothy. Now, the next things that you'll need is 5 cups white flour and 3 cups whole wheat flour. Now, what I do is I just take it and put it in a bowl and mix it all up real good. That way it's already ready to go. And whenever I mix it in here, I only want to mix it with this paddle thing in portions. And I'll show you what I'm talking about. So let's go ahead and lower that down. And can add a little bit. That's about maybe a third of it. And raise this back up. And whenever I stir it, I like to start out just about right here. As you can see, it's already getting to the point where it's mixing real good. And this is why you want to mix it in sections. That way you can make sure that all the lumps are out, which not all of them will get out, but for the majority they should be. And then I kick it up to level 2. Time to add some more. And if you're just doing this like by the cuppage, it's probably about 2.5 cups every time that you add it. Okay, so lift it back up, go to stir. And you'll notice that it's starting to get thicker, and eventually that paddle is going to have a hard time. And that's where this little thing comes in handy, and that little thing comes in handy. This is a dough hook. So whenever it gets to this consistency, whenever it's sticking to the sides and kind of balling up, that's whenever you want to go ahead and transfer from the dough hook, from this paddle thing over to the dough hook. So you also want to add the rest of your flour at this point in time. So let's go ahead and do that. So I didn't add all the rest of my flour. I decided against it because I want you to see more along the lines of how the dough is developing as it goes. But I did add the dough hook, and the dough hook is just basically your hands. It's for kneading. It makes it a lot easier. I mean, if you don't have a KitchenAid, you can do all this by hand, but I just want to show you how the flour is incorporated into the dough and the different textures as you go. That way you know what texture is right. So let's go ahead and start this on the stir. And you don't want to get it too high with your stirring, because honestly, like, it will get kind of crazy and flour will go everywhere, and that's always fun if you're intentionally doing that, having a flour fight. But seeing as we're not, we're just going to use it. Now we can kick it up from your stir level to level 2. As you can see, that dough is getting a lot more firm, and it's starting to somewhat peel away from the walls, and that's what we're wanting. So since that dough is pretty much incorporated with that flour, you're going to go ahead and add the rest of your flour. And technically speaking, this should only take about 5 minutes on this speed, but I like to always play on the safe side and do it for 10. But especially if you're kneading by hand, it's really important to knead it for at least 10 minutes. That way you can get all of the lumps out. And as you can see, there is some that's sticking to the sides, so you'll want to get a spatula, which I'm about to do, or some kind of scraper to make sure that all that's scraped out really good. And so we'll come back in about 10 minutes and see what this looks like. Okay, it's been about 10 minutes, and as you can see, the dough has really pulled nicely away from the bowl. And how you would know if the dough is ready if you were hand kneading, or even by this, because a lot of recipes I had to modify because they either had not enough flour or too much flour. So I like to do what I call the pinch test. And so whenever you pinch it, if it stays and does not stick to your fingers, so it's easily able to be handled, then the dough is ready. Be very careful if you're hand kneading, because you're going to have to flour your surface. Flour it lightly. A good trick that I've learned is to actually wipe down your countertops or whatever that you're going to be kneading on, and sprinkle that with flour just a little bit and rub it around. So this actually limits the amount of flour that you need to use for kneading. But yeah, this dough is really easily able to be handled now. So what I'm going to do is take it out of this, and I'm going to roll it into a ball, and I'll show you what I do next. Okay. This is one heavy freaking dough ball. It is so heavy. So this term that I did whenever I just rolled it up, you know, I didn't do it with one hand, obviously. I did it with two because this is pretty heavy and that wouldn't, anyways, off subject. This is called rounding up your dough. Okay, so you got to get it round like that, and what you want to do is have yourself a round big bowl that is definitely bigger than your dough ball, and spray it down with some cooking spray or oil. I use Pam just because it's easier. So you're going to put your dough ball in there, you're going to turn it, and then you're going to flip it so that the oil side is up. Now, some recipe books will tell you that you can cover this and let it rise on its own for several hours, but me personally, number one, I'm too impatient. Number two, it's just never worked for me like that. So, I've created my own little ways of making things go a little bit quicker. Alright, first things first. Soak yourself a towel with some hot water. And when I'm talking about some hot water, I'm talking about hot. Make it super, super hot. You obviously don't want it too hot to the point where you can't wring it out yourself. Ooh, it's hot. Because again, since yeast is a living thing, heat always promotes growth and things, especially things like funguses and bacteria. And so, this is what we're going to do. We are going to cover our bowl up like so. Trick number one for a speedy process. Trick number two. Preheat your oven just for maybe 2 minutes. Just enough for it to get warm. And then you stick it in the oven and turn your oven off. That way your bread can be rising for the first time. You rise this bread once, it should double in size, and I'll show you what that looks like whenever it's done. And then we'll punch it down. But this should take, with this method, it should take about 45 minutes or an hour for the bread to rise. But it's not going to happen with this oven because this oven has pooped out. That's why it's unplugged. So I'm going to do some laundry and take this over to Mom and Dad's and continue on. Okay, I'm here at Mom and Dad's. One thing I forgot to mention before you put it in the oven is put it on a cookie sheet, because although that oven is not going to be hot enough to cook anything, as you can see, I have a plastic bowl, and so that could potentially melt that, so avoid that at all costs. Just put it on a cookie sheet. So I already have my oven preheated. It's warm inside, so we're going to go on ahead and transfer this. Maybe preheat it a little bit more because it lost some heat. And we're going to set a timer for 1 hour. And that should be good as far as heat goes. Okay, so we will come back in 1 hour and check on this. And if all goes well, then it should have doubled in size. Okay, so now that your bread has risen for the past hour in the oven, doing the quick rise technique that I showed you, you can uncover it and clearly see that your bread has now doubled in size. Now comes to the phase where we actually form our loaves. So first thing that we're going to do with this bread, it's very squishy and everything, is get you some residual flour on your hands. This is that quick technique I was telling you about wetting down the surface first and then flouring it. That way you're not adding too much flour to your recipe. So we're going to punch this dough down, which that just means just to get all of the air out of it. And it should be a little sticky. That's normal. But it's still pliable. Now, turn this over. Onto our floured surface and just kind of roll it. That way it's not super sticking to your hands. And you have your dough ball. Now from here, you want to separate it out into 2 equal pieces. Well, as equal as you can get them at least. So, those are about the same size. From here, we're going to shape our loaves. Now, how you're going to do that is you're going to kind of squish it out into a cylindrical shape at first. Okay, once you have your 2 equal halves from your big dough ball that you have, it's time to form it into loaves. Now to do that, you're going to kind of stretch it out as if you were making a loaf, just like so. Maybe make a little oblong shape with it. And this, the way I'm going to show you how to form a loaf, is going to prevent you from having massive air bubbles in it as much. So first step, you're going to take one end, peel it in, and pinch it. With the other end, you're going to do the same thing. Peel it in and pinch. Now turn to the sides and you will do the same thing. Just peel and pinch. And it's important to pinch because this will keep the steam within your loaf, and you don't want to have too much of that escape. And then you bring it all together in the middle while pinching and sealing it. That way your moisture does not escape, because that results in very dry bread. And then you continue this process. Bring it in, you peel and pinch, and do it again to the other side, and peel and pinch on the sides. And then the corners. And you can kind of play around with this. I mean, it takes some getting used to, but eventually you will get much faster at it. And we are almost done with this loaf. Now, this one is done for the most part. Just sealing some parts here and there. Now, whenever you're done with that, what you're going to do is shape your loaf a little bit more. And you want to let this loaf sit for a few minutes, at least 5 minutes. And what that's going to do is that's going to make the whole entire skin get a little bit firmer. That way it's easier to handle. And so the inside is going to be a lot more moist than the outside, and so it's going to create your skin. And so from there, while this is sitting, you start with this one and you do the same thing. After you're done, place them in a well-oiled bread pan that you already have prepared, and then I'll show you the next step when it comes to baking. Okay, here is your preformed loaves that you made, and you need to put them in your pre-greased bread pans that you have. Now, a lot of times I've had trouble with my bread sinking in the middle, and I know that you score the top to direct the steam out, and I'll go into more detail whenever we get to that portion, but I had a fellow bread making friend who suggested that I slap the bread. So we are going to give this a try. She said to slap your loaves 7 times, and that will get the big air bubbles out of the top. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And you have no idea how retarded I felt doing that. So what you're going to do from this point is stick them in your warmed oven, just like the quick rise solution that I gave you earlier, for 45 minutes, an hour, and that will allow them to rise to their max potential, and then from there we're going to bake. Okay, so now the bread is risen, and we've seen that it's roughly doubled in size from whenever we placed it in the pans. And now what we're going to do, what's known as scoring. Sorry if I'm a little tongue-tied, I'm a little hot. I just got out of the garden. So, anyways, we're going to do scoring. And this is why. Oftentimes on the bread, whenever it cooks, it sometimes will get a sink right down in the middle. Now, this is caused by multiple things, but one of the most common things is there's steam, because remember how we created the skin, okay, so that kept all that in. When the bread's cooking, there's steam all inside of that, and it has to exit some kind of way because the bread can't house all of it. So 9 times out of 10, it's along this edge. So what the scoring actually does is it's going to direct that steam directly out of the top. That way we don't have to worry about our bread falling. So all you're going to do is make little diagonal cuts, or whatever type of design suits your fancy, all along the edge. And you do the same with the second loaf. And this will allow that steam to be directed out. Now what you're going to do is put it back into the warm oven. Since you see it's indented here, we want to get all that risen up really well, so just make the yeast work absolutely the hardest that they can. We're going to put it back in the oven that's warm for about 15 to 20 minutes before we bake. Okay, this is our last step. We are ready to bake, and I'll show you the bread has risen even more. And then whenever we scored it, and those scored pieces have nicely puffed out, just like they're supposed to, so that will let steam out. And what we're going to do is bake this at 375 for 45 minutes. And either that or whenever it's nice and golden brown. So you be the judge at that. Different altitudes and different ovens cook differently. So I can't wait to see what the finished product is like. Well, slap me silly. This is some good bread. This is the end product. I just took it out of the oven. As you can see, it did not fall. So I guess slapping bread actually does work to get those big air bubbles out, because it absolutely didn't fall. What I did was, the moment that I took it out of the oven, I took it out of the containers, because the longer that they stay within the containers, the more they cook, and you do not want overcooking with bread. Now, one thing with homemade bread that's a constant is typically you got a hard crust, but I have a way to counteract that, because with bread you always cook it at a higher temperature, so what typically ends up happening is the middle doesn't get done as quick as the outside does, so you take it out and you think that it's done whenever it's not. But if you like crusty bread, then that's good. My husband does not like a hard crust on his bread, so what I do is, right now this bread just came out, so it's too hot to handle, so I'm going to let it sit for probably about 10-15 minutes, but you want it to still be warm. And then after that, whenever it's easier to handle and it's still warm, you want to put it in a bag. I put mine in a 2-gallon baggie, because a gallon baggie won't ever seem to fit these big loaves. So I use a 2-gallon baggie, and you just let it finish cooling there. And what it does is it creates a condensation that softens the crust. It doesn't make your bread wet, not anywhere near wet. It just keeps it from being so hard if you're not a hard crust person. So, anyways, there is honey wheat bread, and I invite you to subscribe. If this helped you, tell a friend. If you have any comments or questions, let me know. If you got a better way to do what I'm doing, I am all ears. I am learning too. So, yeah, thank you for watching the video. Y'all have a good day.